Good evening, everybody. Washington's second largest city is on fire right now, and the numbers coming out of Spokane are almost impossible to process. 640 structures gone, 62,000 people forced out of their homes with basically no warning, 0% containment on a fire that started as a single ignition point next to a road. This is being called the worst natural disaster this region has ever faced, and it happened in less than 72 hours. So let's talk about how a city of 230,000 people ends up watching entire neighborhoods disappear in a single weekend. Because once you lay out the timeline, this thing is honestly terrifying. It started just before noon on Saturday, August 1st, west of Spokane, near Old Trails Road and West Euclid Road, close to Airway Heights. At that point, it's nothing. It's a fire in dry grass, the kind of ignition that happens somewhere in the American West basically every single day during fire season. Except this time, the National Weather Service had already issued something they almost never issue. A particularly dangerous situation, red flag warning for central and eastern Washington. That's not a normal red flag day. That's the highest tier alert the Weather Service has for fire danger. And it's usually reserved for maybe a handful of days a year across the entire country. Wind gusts were running 35 to 50 miles an hour. Humidity was sitting in the single digits. That combination is basically rocket fuel for a wildfire, and within hours this thing stopped behaving like a normal grass fire and started behaving like something else entirely. By the afternoon it had grown fast enough that it jumped the Spokane River. Think about that for a second. Rivers are supposed to be natural fire breaks. Firefighters count on water to stop, or at least slow down a spreading blaze, and in a lot of past fires around the same region, that's exactly what's happened. This fire didn't care. It jumped the river, pushed into Riverside State Park, and then rolled straight into residential neighborhoods in northwest Spokane, specifically Indian Trail and 5 Mile Prairie. These are established, lived-in neighborhoods, families who have been there for decades. And within a matter of hours, the fire, now officially named the Old Trails Fire, was standing in their backyards. Spokane County Fire District 3. Fire Chief Cody Rohrbach put a number on it that's honestly staggering. 640 structures destroyed from the Old Trails Fire alone. Not damaged, destroyed. And officials have been upfront that they still don't have a full breakdown of how many of those were primary homes versus garages, sheds, and outbuildings, because when a neighborhood burns at this speed, you don't get to do a careful inventory while it's happening. You get people out first, and you count what's left standing later. Early estimates from Sunday actually had the number sitting closer to 600 structures across the whole complex before officials revised it upward past 700 by Monday, with Old Trails alone accounting for the overwhelming majority of that total. To put the speed of this in perspective, by the time most people on the East Coast were sitting down to dinner on Saturday, a fire that didn't exist 12 hours earlier had already consumed enough ground to threaten thousands of homes, and by the time the sun came up Sunday morning, the number of destroyed structures was already being counted in the hundreds. That's the kind of timeline that used to take days to unfold in a lot of historical wildfire events. Here it happened over the course of a single afternoon and evening, and Old Trails wasn't burning alone. 2 other fires ignited that same day. The Fairview Fire broke out near Meade, north of the city. The Autumn Lane Fire started near 5 Mile Falls. All 3 fires were moving fast enough, in the same red flag conditions, that officials made the call to manage them together under one incident command, now referred to as the Spokane Complex Fire. And by Sunday night, the Autumn Lane Fire had actually become the single largest of the 3, growing by another 1,000 acres overnight alone. Combined, these 3 fires have burned more than 8,000 acres. That's roughly 12.5 square miles of a metro area, all burning at once, all fed by the same wind event. And, as of the most recent reporting, containment across the entire complex sits at 0%. 0. That's not a typo. 3 fires, 8,000 acres, 600 plus homes and structures gone, and firefighters have not yet been able to draw a single, fully contained line around any of it. Spokane Mayor Lisa Brown stood in front of cameras and said, "This is the worst natural disaster our region has faced. Not one of the worst. The worst." And when the mayor of a city with over 2 centuries of recorded history says that in a region that has already seen its fair share of major wildfires over the last decade, you have to sit with what that actually means for the people living through it right now. Now here's the number that I think gets lost in the shuffle of acreage totals and structure counts. 65,000 people under evacuation orders within Spokane city limits alone. 65,000 people who, in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, had to make a decision in minutes about what they could carry out of their house and what they were going to leave behind, not knowing if they'd have a house to come back to at all. Some of those evacuees didn't get much warning. There are accounts of families getting phone alerts while they were already driving into the city, embers falling around their cars, smoke turning the sky black in the middle of the afternoon like it was midnight. One Spokane City Councilman described his own parents evacuating, going back briefly to grab their dogs and then watching from a distance as the fire swept through and took both their house and his uncle's house 2 doors down, a home the family had lived in since 2003 and had just finished paying off the year before. That's the kind of story playing out across these neighborhoods right now, multiplied by the hundreds, and it's worth sitting with, because behind every one of those 640 structures is a version of that exact same phone call, that exact same drive back into a neighborhood already filling with smoke. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. As of the most recent updates, there have been no confirmed deaths and no confirmed injuries from this fire. Officials are crediting that directly to how aggressively and how early the evacuation orders went out, and to just how much manpower got thrown at the evacuation effort in those first critical hours. More than 200 missing person reports came in during the chaos of the first 24 hours alone, and officials have cleared the overwhelming majority of those, with only a small handful still being tracked down as of the latest count. When you consider the speed of this fire, the number of structures lost, and the population density of the neighborhoods it tore through, a 0 fatality count so far is honestly close to a miracle. And it's a direct result of a lot of very fast, very difficult decisions made by emergency crews in real time under conditions that were officially rated as particularly dangerous before a single spark had even landed. So what's the response looked like on the ground? Washington Governor Bob Ferguson declared a statewide emergency, which, among other things, prohibits most outdoor and agricultural burning across the entire state, while these fires remain active. Because the absolute last thing anyone needs right now is a second ignition source competing for the same stretched firefighting resources. Ferguson activated 110 members of the Washington National Guard specifically to help with the firefighting effort, and the State Fire Marshal's Office has mobilized 13 separate task forces into the region. That's a serious commitment of manpower and equipment being funneled into one metro area, and it's happening because local crews, as capable as they are, simply cannot handle 3 simultaneous large fires burning through an urban interface entirely on their own. Ferguson also confirmed he spoke directly with President Trump and with Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen about the situation, describing the conversation as gracious and saying the federal government fully understood how dire things were on the ground before the call even started. A request for immediate FEMA support has already been submitted, along with a second separate request specifically for long-term recovery funding, because rebuilding 600-plus structures is not a short-term project. Officials have been honest that it could be a week, could be several weeks, before most evacuated residents are even allowed back into their neighborhoods just to see what's left standing, let alone begin any kind of rebuild. On top of all of that, more than 40,000 utility customers lost power across the region as the fires tore through infrastructure, which complicates everything from running water pumps to keeping emergency shelters operational. Crews are trying to fight an active wildfire, restore power, run evacuation logistics, and clear missing person reports all at the same time, in conditions that were officially designated as particularly dangerous before this whole thing even began. It's a lot of moving parts for one regional emergency system to manage simultaneously. And so far, by most accounts, they've managed to keep the death toll at 0 while doing it. And speaking of how this actually started, this is where the story takes a turn a lot of people weren't expecting. On Monday, Spokane County Sheriff John Knowles announced the arrest of a 37-year-old man named Aaron Farinacci in connection with starting the Old Trails fire. According to witnesses, he had been seen kneeling in the grass near the fire's ignition point on West Euclid Road right around the time it started, wearing a green shirt and carrying a backpack. Multiple people in the area later told reporters and investigators they remembered seeing him walking through the exact same stretch of road shortly before flames broke out. He was taken into custody roughly 4 miles from where the fire began, and investigators say they're working closely with fire district partners to build the full case. And it turns out this isn't his first serious brush with the law. Public records show Farinacci was previously charged back in 2010 in connection with the killing of his own father during an argument in Mesa, Arizona. Now he's facing charges connected to a fire that has destroyed the homes of hundreds of families and displaced tens of thousands of people. Investigators have been careful to say the case is still developing and that they're not getting ahead of the evidence. But the timeline they've laid out, a man spotted kneeling at the exact ignition point minutes before flames appear, arrested a few miles away shortly after, is about as direct a chain of circumstantial evidence as you're going to see in a case like this. Think about the math on that for a second. One ignition. One person allegedly in one specific spot, on one specific day where the wind and humidity conditions happened to be sitting at their absolute worst point of the entire summer. And the output of that single moment was 8,000 acres burned, 640 structures destroyed, 65,000 people evacuated, and an entire city's emergency system pushed right up to its limit. That's the terrifying math of wildfire in the American West right now. The margin between a small contained brush fire and a regional disaster is razor thin, and every year that margin seems to get thinner, because the conditions on the other side of that margin, the heat, the dryness, the wind, keep getting more extreme. Fire behavior analysts have a term for this kind of event. They call it a wind-driven urban interface fire, and it's become one of the defining disaster types of the last decade across the West. It's different from the classic image of a wildfire creeping through remote forest for days or weeks before anyone's home is ever threatened. This is fire moving directly into where people actually live, at speeds that outrun standard evacuation timelines on a scale that overwhelms local resources before mutual aid can even fully arrive. The 2018 Camp Fire in California, the 2023 Lahaina Fire in Hawaii, and now Old Trails in Spokane all share that same basic profile: extreme wind, low humidity, dry fuel, in a populated area sitting directly in the path. Each one of those events forced massive policy conversations afterward about evacuation infrastructure, building codes in wildfire-prone zones, and vegetation management near residential neighborhoods. Spokane is very likely about to trigger that same kind of conversation across Washington state and probably across the broader region, given how many similar fires have hit the same corridor of eastern Washington in recent years. And this isn't even the first time this exact stretch of eastern Washington has been through something like this. Back in 2023, the Gray Fire tore through the area around Medical Lake, just a short drive from where Old Trail started, destroying more than 180 structures and killing one person after jumping a major interstate. A few years before that, in 2020, a fire pushed through the small town of Malden and destroyed roughly 80% of every structure in that community in a single afternoon. So this region has a documented, repeated history of fast-moving, wind-driven fires turning into structure-destroying disasters almost overnight. And Old Trails just became the largest and most destructive entry on that list. If you're keeping score, that's 3 separate mass casualty scale wildfire events hitting the same general corridor of eastern Washington in roughly 6 years. And each one has been driven by the same basic recipe: dry grass, low humidity, and wind gusts strong enough to outrun the crews trying to contain them. Now let's zoom out for a second, because Spokane is not happening in a vacuum. This is part of a pattern playing out across the entire western United States this summer, and honestly, the numbers on a national scale are just as alarming as anything happening in Washington right now. Just south in Oregon, crews have been fighting the Roe Creek Complex fire, which has burned nearly 500 square miles with containment sitting around 57%. That's an enormous fire in its own right, and it's been burning for long enough that Oregon's Division of Financial Regulation had to step in and issue an emergency order forcing insurance companies to pause policy cancellations and extend grace periods for people sitting in active evacuation zones. Because the reality is, insurers were already pulling back from high-risk wildfire areas before this season even started, and a disaster on this scale forces the state's hand to protect homeowners from getting dropped by their carrier in the middle of an active emergency. The Bureau of Land Management confirmed fire restrictions remain in effect across all public lands in both Oregon and Washington. And the National Weather Service issued that same particularly dangerous situation warning for parts of Oregon just days before Spokane went up. This wasn't some isolated freak event. The entire region was flashing the same warning signs at basically the same time. A brutal heat wave has been sitting over large parts of the western U.S., pushing temperatures to record levels and drying out vegetation that was already stressed from a dry spring. Meteorologists are pointing to an unusually strong El Niño pattern as part of what's driving this, a natural warming of the equatorial Pacific that alters weather patterns and spikes temperatures globally, and this year's El Niño is already tracking as one of the most intense on record. And it's not just a Western problem anymore either. By early April of this year, wildfire acreage nationally had already hit over 7 million acres, which works out to roughly 231% of the 10-year average, meaning the country was already burning more than twice its historical pace before summer had even really started. In March, the Morill Fire became the largest wildfire ever recorded in Nebraska's history. In April, 2 separate fires in southern Georgia burned more than 50,000 combined acres and destroyed more than 120 homes, the most homes ever lost to wildfire in that state's recorded history. Fire season used to have a pretty predictable geography, mostly California, mostly late summer. That geography is breaking down, and it's breaking down fast. So here's the connection that's easy to miss if you're only looking at the headline coming out of Spokane. Every one of these fires, from Nebraska to Georgia to Oregon to Washington, is riding the exact same underlying setup. Record heat, abnormally dry fuel, and wind events strong enough to turn a small ignition into an uncontrollable spread within hours. The Old Trails fire didn't need a lightning storm or a downed power line to become a regional catastrophe. Investigators say the reported cause is human. All it needed was one person, one moment, and conditions that were already primed to take a small mistake and turn it into the worst disaster a region has ever seen. That's really the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this whole story. It's not that the fuel or the wind or the heat caused this on their own. It's that those conditions turned what should have been a routine, forgettable grass fire into something that erased 640 structures before crews could even get a real handle on it. And that's really the strategic piece nobody's fully connecting yet. This isn't just a wildfire story, it's an insurance and infrastructure story that's been building for years, and Spokane just became the latest and most visible example of it. Right now, 34 states, including Washington, California, Colorado, Oregon, and New Mexico, either already have or are actively building FAIR plans, which are essentially insurer of last resort programs for homeowners who can no longer get standard coverage because their property sits in a high wildfire risk zone. These plans get funded by pooling assessments across every insurance company operating in the state. So when a fire like this one destroys 600 plus structures in a single weekend, it doesn't just hit the homeowners who lost everything. It sends a financial shockwave through the entire insurance pool, and those costs eventually work their way back down to every policyholder in the state through higher premiums, whether or not their own home was ever anywhere near the fire line. That cycle has already been running hot in California, where the January 2025 fires around Los Angeles generated an estimated $40 billion in insured losses, the costliest wildfire event on record at the time it happened. Legal experts tracking wildfire litigation have been warning all year that events on that scale were not going to stay isolated to California, and utility companies across the West are already facing lawsuits over decisions made weeks or months before ignitions ever occurred. Things like whether power lines should have been de-energized during severe wind conditions, or whether equipment maintenance and vegetation clearing should have happened sooner. Spokane is very likely about to become the next major data point in that same conversation. Except this time, the ignition wasn't a utility line at all. Based on what investigators have laid out, it was allegedly a person standing in dry grass on the single worst wind day of the summer, which raises a whole different set of legal and policy questions than a downed power line does. Because when a utility is found responsible, there's a corporation with assets and insurance behind it that victims can pursue for damages. When the alleged cause is an individual with essentially no assets to speak of, the burden of covering 640 destroyed structures falls almost entirely back onto homeowners, insurance, FAIR plans, and federal disaster assistance. That's a very different financial picture for the families trying to rebuild, and it's part of why the FEMA request and the state emergency declaration matter so much here. Without that federal and state backstop, a huge number of these families would be relying almost entirely on whatever coverage they already had in place, in a market where wildfire coverage has been getting harder and more expensive to secure with every passing fire season. It also raises a pointed question that's likely to follow this story for a long time. If the cause really does turn out to be arson, does that change how insurers and lawmakers think about liability and prevention going forward? Utility-caused fires have pushed states towards stricter power line regulations and de-energization protocols. A human-caused ignition on a red flag day raises a different set of questions entirely, about enforcement of burn bans, about surveillance and reporting near known high-risk corridors, and about what, if anything, could realistically have stopped one person from lighting a match in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. And it's not just the emergency response side that's under strain either. Think about what happens to a local housing market when 640 structures disappear in a weekend. That's not a small dent. In a mid-sized metro area, losing that many homes at once puts immediate pressure on an already tight rental and housing market because 65,000 evacuated people don't just need somewhere to shelter for a few nights. A meaningful chunk of them are going to need somewhere to actually live for months while their homes get rebuilt or while they decide whether to rebuild at all. School districts in the affected neighborhoods are going to be dealing with displaced families, right, as a new school year gets underway. Local businesses in Indian Trail and 5 Mile Prairie that depended on neighborhood foot traffic are suddenly sitting in areas with far fewer residents around to support them. None of that shows up in the acreage or containment numbers, but it's very much part of what this disaster is going to look like 6 months and 12 months from now, long after the smoke has cleared and the cameras have moved on to the next story. So when you step back and look at the full picture, what you're really looking at is a system running right at the edge of its capacity in almost every direction at once. Fire crews stretched across 3 simultaneous fires in one metro area. National Guard troops activated because local resources alone weren't enough. An insurance system already straining nationally before this fire even started. A power grid losing tens of thousands of customers in a matter of hours. and a warning system that did everything right, issuing that rare, particularly dangerous situation alert well before a single flame appeared. And it still wasn't enough to stop 640 structures from burning to the ground in under 3 days. The warning worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't able to stop what happened once the ignition actually occurred. The one piece of good news, if you can call it that, is the response itself. Officials are pointing to cooler temperatures and lighter winds moving into the region, giving crews their best working conditions in days. Evacuation levels for parts of the old trails and Fairview fires have already started being downgraded in some areas, which is a genuinely encouraging sign after 3 straight days of expansion. But officials have also been upfront that hotter weather is expected to return by midweek, which means the window crews are working with right now is narrow and everyone on the ground knows it. Widespread reentry into the hardest hit neighborhoods is still likely days, if not weeks away, and the investigation into exactly how this all started and whether anything could have prevented it is still very much active and ongoing. There's also a broader resilience story unfolding here that's easy to overlook in the middle of all the destruction. The Spokane region has reportedly rallied together to raise well over $1.5 million in relief funds. In just the first few days, community shelters have opened up across the county. Tribal community spaces have offered themselves up as safe gathering points for displaced families. And local organizations have been mobilizing support for people who quite literally have nothing left but what they managed to grab on their way out the door. That kind of rapid community response doesn't undo the loss, but it does say something about how a region pulls together when a disaster on this scale hits without warning. It's also worth talking about what this does to the workforce actually fighting these fires, because that's a piece of the story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Crews from multiple states have been rotating through the Spokane area, some of them coming straight off other large fire assignments elsewhere in the West, with barely any time to rest in between. Fire agencies have openly said their resources are being stretched extremely thin, trying to cover multiple large wildfires burning at the same time, not just in Washington, but across a region where several states are all competing for the same limited pool of engines, aircraft, and personnel. When you've got Roe Creek still burning in Oregon, other complexes active elsewhere, and now 3 fires tearing through a major Washington city all at once, the entire regional firefighting system starts operating less like a series of isolated responses and more like a single overstretched network trying to cover far more ground than it was ever built to handle in one summer. That's part of why officials have been so blunt about timelines. Nobody wants to promise families they can go home in a few days when the honest answer is that containment lines haven't even been established yet, and when the crews needed to build those lines are being pulled in multiple directions at once. It's a sobering reminder that a modern wildfire response isn't just about one fire department versus one blaze anymore. It's regional logistics, mutual aid agreements, National Guard deployments, and now, increasingly, a criminal investigation running in parallel with an active emergency response. So where does this leave things? You've got a suspect in custody with a documented violent history in his past, an ignition point that lines up almost perfectly with the single most dangerous weather window of the entire year, and a city of over 200,000 people trying to figure out how to rebuild 640 structures, while thousands of families are still sitting in shelters or with relatives waiting to find out if they even have a home left to go back to. And zoomed out even further, you've got an entire western United States fire season that is already running well ahead of historical averages, in a year where major record-breaking fires are showing up in places that historically almost never saw them, from the plains of Nebraska to the pine forests of southern Georgia. There's one more angle worth sitting with before we wrap this up, and it's the timing of it all. This is happening right at the very start of August, which historically is nowhere near the peak of fire season for this part of the country. Fire officials have already said out loud that this year is shaping up to be one of the busiest wildfire years on record, and that statement was made before old trails even existed. If the region is already dealing with a disaster of this scale this early, with hotter weather still expected to return midweek, the honest concern among people who track this stuff for a living is that Spokane might not be the last major flashpoint this season, not just in Washington, but across the wider red flag corridor stretching from eastern Washington down through Oregon and into the northern Rockies. What do you guys think is actually going to change after this? Do you think this pushes states to get more aggressive about outdoor burn restrictions and enforcement during red flag conditions? Or do you think it's ultimately the insurance and rebuilding costs that end up forcing the bigger policy changes down the road? And honestly, what do you make of the arrest itself, given the timeline investigators have laid out so far and the history attached to the suspect? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear how people are reading this one, especially if you've got any connection to the Spokane area or you've lived through something similar yourself. And if you want to stay on top of how this develops, the recovery effort, the ongoing investigation, whatever comes out of it next, make sure you're subscribed and you've got notifications turned on, because This is still very much an active, developing situation, and there's a lot more likely to come out in the days ahead. Hit. Like, if this breakdown actually helped you understand the scale of what's happening out there, and share it with anyone you know who might have family or friends in the Spokane area right now, because a lot of people are still trying to figure out what's even going on beyond the headline numbers. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.